A jade vase came down on my skull on the morning of my wedding, and my twin sister's face was the last thing I saw clearly in that life. I died kneeling in my bridal red, the cracked spirit egg, the one everyone had told me to be ashamed of, still cradled against my chest. But death, I would learn, was only the sect's crudest lesson. I opened my eyes 3 years earlier, on the morning of the bestowal, and my sister had just smiled at me the exact same way she would one day smile as she killed me. I need you to understand what the bestowal meant before I tell you what I did with it. Once every generation, the Azure Phoenix sect cracks open the vault beneath Mount Zhaoyang and brings out the eggs. True phoenix eggs, harvested from the sect's sacred flock, each one bonded for life to whichever disciple is chosen to carry it. A perfect egg meant a perfect future, a familiar of fire and wind, a place at the elders' table, a betrothal to whichever golden sun the sect wanted flattered. In my first life, there were 2 eggs left when it came to my sister and me, because we were the sect leader's twin nieces, and someone, somewhere, had decided that meant we deserved to choose before anyone else. 1 egg gleamed like poured gold, veins of light pulsing beneath a shell so smooth it looked wet. The other was small, gray, and split down the middle by a crack that never closed, weeping a thin black ichor that smelled of char and old blood. The healers called it stillborn. My aunt called it an embarrassment. My sister, already reaching for the golden one, called it a mercy that it never has to know it failed. In my first life, I took the golden egg because I was told to, and it made me exactly the disciple the sect wanted: obedient, decorated, engaged within the year to Jing Muyan, heir to the sect's military wing. A man with a streak of premature gray through his black hair and eyes that measured everything twice before he trusted it. I thought I had won. I did not understand, not for 3 more years, that the egg glowing gold in my hand had been purchased, not grown, smuggled in from a black market breeder who fed spirit hatchlings on stolen qi until they swelled bright and hollow, parasites dressed as prizes. I did not understand that the real prize, the one my sister would come to want so badly she'd crack my skull open for it, was the ugly, weeping, cracked thing I'd been too proud to touch. A void phoenix hatches only from suffering. It cannot be bought, farmed, or forced. It has to be bled for. My sister figured that out 4 years too late, standing over my body in her white bridal veil, the vase still in her hand, whispering, "You always got everything easy. Not this time." She was wrong on both counts, and now she was going to find that out from the very beginning. I woke on Dampstone in the bestowal hall, 3 years younger, my heart hammering against ribs that had, in another life, already stopped. The gold egg and the cracked gray one sat exactly where they had before, on the same black lacquer table, under the same disapproving eyes of the elders. My sister was already reaching. I let her take the gold one without a flicker on my face. Around us, disciples murmured. My aunt's mouth had already curled into the shape of an apology she wouldn't have to give. I stepped forward, past the murmurs, past the collective-held breath of everyone certain I would take the safe, radiant, correct choice, and I closed both hands around the cracked egg instead. The hall went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when it's deciding whether to laugh at you. Someone did laugh eventually, a disciple near the back, quickly hushed by an elder's glare, though not quickly enough. My aunt's voice cracked down the center like the egg itself. "Ning," thing is dead. It has been dead for a decade. Do you understand what you're doing?" I told her I understood perfectly. I did not tell her that I had already watched it hatch once, from the wrong side of death, into something that turned an entire arena to ash. Jing Muyan, seated among the elders' sons that day, for the first time as an observer of the bestowal, did not laugh. He watched me lift the weeping cracked shell to my chest with an expression I would not properly name until much later. Not pity, not amusement, but the particular stillness of a man filing something away to examine later when no one was watching him do it. My sister's engagement to him came 4 months after that in my first life, and it came again now, right on schedule, because nothing about her ambition needed a rewind to activate. She wore the gold egg on a velvet cushion to the announcement banquet, like a trophy, and it hatched 2 weeks later into a hatchling with feathers the color of molten coin. Gorgeous in the specific, aggressive way that objects are gorgeous when they exist to be looked at rather than to survive. The banquet hall erupted in applause. My sister accepted it with the particular grace of someone who has never once doubted she deserved it. I clapped along with everyone else, my cracked egg wrapped in cloth in my lap, silent, unhatched, still weeping its thin black ichor onto the fabric. "Bad luck," someone at my table murmured, not quietly enough. She should have let the healers put it out of its misery months ago. I smiled and said nothing. Saying nothing had become, I was discovering, its own kind of weapon. For the better part of a year, my sister's rise was the only story the sect wanted to tell. Her hatchling, she named it Jinhui, golden glory without a trace of irony, grew fast, ate constantly, and glittered exactly as much as everyone expected a proper phoenix familiar to glitter. She was invited to spar exhibitions. She was seated at the elders' banquet table, in the chair that used to be mine. She began, with a casualness that told me she'd rehearsed it, to refer to Jing Muyan as my Muyan in front of me at family functions, watching my face for a crack that never came. Once in the sect gardens, she found me feeding the cracked egg drops of my own blood from a shallow cut on my palm. The only sustenance it had ever accepted, discovered by pure, desperate instinct in my first life's final month. And she laughed so hard, she had to sit down on the garden bench. "You're bleeding for a corpse," she said, wiping her eyes. "I almost feel sorry for you." Almost. Then she plucked one of Jinhui's molted golden feathers from her sleeve, twirled it between 2 fingers, and let it drop deliberately into the dirt in front of me before she walked away. I picked it up after she'd gone. It was warmer than it should have been, feverish almost. And it left a faint gray smudge of ash on my fingertips that took 3 washes to remove. I said nothing to anyone. I simply filed it away, the way Jing Muyan had once filed away the sight of me choosing the cracked shell. I asked the sect leader for the obsidian crag 6 months after the bestowal. A half-collapsed training ground on the mountain's northern face, abandoned since a rock slide made it too dangerous for formal use. Exactly the kind of worthless, forgotten place that suited a worthless, forgotten disciple. Nobody objected to losing track of me there. That was the point. For the next year and 8 months, the obsidian crag became my sanctuary, my laboratory, and my confession booth in that order. I learned the mechanism the healers had never bothered to learn in my first life. A void phoenix isn't dead. It's dormant deliberately, because it refuses to draw on ambient spiritual energy the way every other hatchling does. The same ambient energy that black market breeders concentrate and force feed into farmed eggs to fake a glow. A void phoenix has to be primed on something no breeder can fake or force. Freely given blood, given without being asked, night after night, until the creature inside trusts that the hand feeding it isn't going to flinch away first. Every other egg in sect history had been abandoned by the third or fourth night, because every other disciple wanted proof of progress before they were willing to keep bleeding into what looked, by every visible measure, like nothing at all. I gave it 211 nights before it so much as pulsed. The cost was not romantic, and I won't pretend it was. My palms scarred over into a permanent lattice of thin white lines that I learned to hide under sect gloves. I fainted twice from blood loss in the first winter, alone on the crag's stone floor, and taught myself afterward to ration the cuts more carefully, timing them to the mountain's coldest hours when my body ran slowest and needed less. I lied to the healers about a chronic training injury to explain the scars whenever a physical exam required my hands bared, and on the 211th night, in the middle of a snowstorm that had knocked out 3 of the crag's 4 remaining watch lanterns, the shell split clean down its old crack, and something unfolded out of it that had no feathers at all. Instead, a smooth, faintly translucent hide the color of a night sky with no moon in it, threaded through with hairline veins of violet light that pulsed in time with my own heartbeat, as if it had spent 211 nights learning my pulse and decided to keep it. It did not glow. It absorbed. The lantern light around it seemed to bend inward toward its skin and vanish. I would learn later that this was its entire nature. A void phoenix doesn't generate power. It consumes and converts whatever is offered to it, freely, and returns it transformed. My sister's phoenix had been built to shine so that everyone would see it. Mine had been built to take in the dark and give back something the dark had never contained before. I named her Anlin, still current, deep, and told absolutely no one she existed. The cracks in my sister's glory started the way I had learned from my first life that they always start, quietly and from the inside, and reaching her only after everyone else had already noticed. Jinhui's molding slowed first, then stopped entirely, its feathers dulling from molten coin to a tarnished, sickly bronze that no amount of oiling could restore. Then came the seizures. Brief at first, dismissed by the sect healers as growing pains common to rapid hatchlings, until they lengthened into full-body convulsions that left Jinhui shrieking, and my sister white-faced in the training yard, cradling it, while disciples pretended not to stare. I heard about all of this, the way the narrative always seemed to arrange itself for me now, secondhand, from a fellow disciple breathless with gossip, while I sat calmly mending a glove in the crag's mouth, with Anlin curled invisible and dozing in my lap. They think it's some kind of parasite, the disciple told me, eyes wide with the particular relish people reserve for someone else's disaster. Feeding on her own cultivator's spiritual core instead of the other way around. The healers can't reverse it. They don't even understand what's doing it. I asked, with what I hoped sounded like idle politeness, whether anyone had traced where the egg originally came from. The disciple didn't know. I did. a parasite egg, farmed on stolen ki and dressed up gold, doesn't know how to stop consuming once its own reservoir runs dry. It simply reaches for the next reservoir in reach. And the closest reservoir to a bonded familiar is always its bonded cultivator. My sister had spent a year feeding her own life force into a creature designed from birth to devour whatever was nearest. She had built her own punishment with her own hands and called it a prize. The Sect Ascension Tournament came at the end of that second winter, exactly as it had in my first life, in the same vast ceremonial arena, beneath the same carved phoenix archway, before the same crowd of disciples, elders, and family who had once watched me die in bridal red for less. My sister fought in the third bracket, Xue trembling and gray-feathered at her side, its once molten plumage now the color of ash, before ash even finishes burning. Her opponent barely had to press her before Jinhui's control frayed entirely. The creature convulsed mid-flight, screeched once in a register that made half the arena wince, and simply came apart, feather and bone and light, dissolving into a fine gray ash that drifted down over the sand like the world's cruelest snowfall. My sister dropped to her knees in the wreckage of it, screaming a name that used to mean glory, and the entire arena went still in the way a room goes still when it has just watched something it doesn't have the vocabulary to describe. Elders half rose from their seats. Jing Muyan, seated among them, did not look away from her. But he did not move toward her either. I did not seek the moment that came next. It came to me, the way the failing side had always come to me first in every life this had happened. My aunt's voice, sharp with a fear I had never once heard her use on my behalf, calling my name across the arena floor, asking, demanding whether I had anything that might help. Because the sect's healers were already saying there was nothing left in Jinhui to save, and the parasite's collapse was pulling at the ambient qi of the entire arena like a drain pulling bathwater. I rose. I did not run. I walked out onto the sand in the same unhurried pace I had walked toward the cracked egg 3 years earlier, and I let Anlin uncurl from beneath my sleeve for the first time in front of anyone at all. She did not glow. She drank. The gray ash of Jinhui's collapse, the frantic bleed of ambient ki threatening to destabilize the whole arena, the murmured panic of 400 onlookers. Anlin pulled all of it toward her, like a held breath finally released, and the space around us went dark and utterly silent for 3 full seconds before she gave it back. Transformed, a slow bloom of violet-black light spreading outward from where I stood, cool and quiet and absolute, closing the drain, steadying the air, settling over the arena like the moment just after a held breath. Nobody gasped immediately. They were too busy remembering how to breathe themselves. My aunt was the first to find her voice, and what she found in it was horror, not relief. Because the specific, cool, absorbing color bleeding out from my hands was the exact color, I would learn afterward, of a signature technique that had vanished from the sect's historical records 3 generations ago, one associated with a line of cultivators quietly purged for being unstable. Someone in my family tree had carried this before me. Someone in my family tree had been punished for it. My aunt's mouth opened and closed twice before she managed, that color, that's not possible, that bloodline was... She never finished the sentence. She didn't need to. I watched the exact moment the dawning horror crossed her face and settled there permanently. and I said nothing at all, because by then I had learned that my silence did more work than any explanation ever could. My sister knelt in the ash of what used to be her glory, staring at me with an expression I recognized from a memory that, technically, hadn't happened to this version of her yet. The same face she'd worn over my dying body in bridal red, except now it was aimed at herself. "You planned this," she said, voice cracking. "You knew." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered, and when I did, my voice came out exactly as calm as it had the day I chose the cracked egg in the first place. I bled for 211 nights, so that egg would trust me enough to live. You bought yours in a week and called it a blessing. I didn't plan your parasite, Rue. You did that yourself, the same way you did the vase. Half the arena had no idea what the vase meant. It didn't matter. She understood, and that was the only audience that line was ever really for. Destiny doesn't hand anyone a gift. It only ever hands out consequences, dressed up as whatever you were desperate enough to believe you'd earned. My sister spent a year mistaking someone else's theft for her own glory, and the theft came due exactly the way theft always does. Quietly, then all at once, in front of everyone who once applauded it. I spent that same year bleeding into a thing the whole sect had already decided was worthless, because I had already died once, believing the easy, glittering choice was the safe one. It wasn't. It never is. What an absolute roller coaster of a story. Xue Ning didn't just survive her sister's betrayal, she completely dismantled the entire lie her sister's power was built on, proving that true strength can never be bought, farmed, or faked. Did you love seeing Xue Ru finally get exactly what she deserved, right in front of the sect that used to worship her? Let me know in the comments below. If this story had you hooked, hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and share this video with a friend who lives for a good rebirth and revenge story. And make sure you subscribe to the channel for more incredible, twist-filled, dramatic storytelling videos. Because the next story is going to be even wilder. See you in the next one.